Okay, let's make a little revision. What we started off last week was considering the nature of our emotions. And we said that in our analysis of the nature of the personality of the human being, there are basically 7 emotion phases, measures, flows, expressions. There isn't an English cultural word that accurately portrays what it is that we call an English emotion. In fact, the English word emotion is a misnomer because, as we discovered last week, if we wanted to define what emotion is, we would have great difficulty in so doing. These 7 expressions of emotion, coupled with the 3 expressions of mind, make up the totality of our personality. Where do these 10 derive from? They derive from our inner self. Consciousness becomes its expression. Our consciousness has therefore 2 pathways, emotion and mind. There are 2 pathways of consciousness. They're quite distinct. One of the tests of mastery of a human being is the capacity to be able to take these 2 flows and balance them. So seichel and midos can be balanced in order to create what now more commonly is called emotional intelligence. Okay? The problem is that while we now know it in theory to some extent, and we understand that we have to practice, mastery teachings to be able to actually train that are not very common. And that's one of the things that Chabad really insists on, that one has to actually train in order to practice that balance, especially in this regard. And the basic teaching that the Alter Rebbe noted as the mastery adage is Moach Shalit al Halev, that the mind has to create the outcomes of the emotions. We said that mind is compass, emotion is energy. Energy doesn't have compass. Compass doesn't have energy. But you have to put the 2 together. But first you need a compass bearing that says this is a wise emotion and this is not a wise emotion. How do we actually find ourselves doing things wisely and unwisely? One of the dynamics that we are told is that we are a duality, that we're made up of 2 aspects, 2 flows. One is a flow that says, I'm for myself, ego, self-preservation, instinctive survival. And the other one part of us says selflessness, compassion, sharing, etc. These are 2 equal and opposite polar tendencies. Both our mind and our emotions can flow through either one or the other. How do they end up flowing through one or the other? In only one of 2 ways. Wise choice or unwise choice, or habit. Habit means the way that the electrostatics of the brain, the neurotransmitters, are habituated to create a pattern. The more you do something, we said last week, the more you're likely to repeat it. And we use the example that angry people tend to become angrier by expressing anger, not vice versa. That's habitual behavior. So if your balance of mind and emotion is habituated, it's very hard to break out of that groove. Or if you make an unwise choice. If you make an unwise choice, obviously that also has negative results, or can have negative results. So the only way that we can ensure that we're able to impact the world in a positive way is to direct consciousness through our higher self, the Nefesh Elokit. That requires practice. And then we identified 2 aspects of love, or 2 kinds of love. The Baal Tanya, the author of the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe notes that there's one called Ahava Rabbah and the other one called Ahavat Olam. Ahava Rabbah means a kind of love that you can't even begin to imagine, where you're completely oblivious to anything negative, where you're intoxicated with the total spirituality of life, where you actually are blind to anything which in some shape or form forms a barrier to your loving repose. The Alter Rebbe says, this you cannot get unless it's a gift min hashamayim, unless it's a gift from above. To get there, however, you have to work hard to get to a point where you deserve to be able to have that gift. He says, don't aspire to that. We've still got other attributes. So he says, ahavat olam. Ahavas olam means the kind of love that you can generate through contemplative, meditative activity where you focus on what the nature of the world is. What is the cosmos? What is the universe? The absolute greatness, the absolute expanse, the way that there is a spiritual way of entertaining life by flowing through it, making a table, making a cup a cup. Memale, the way that the energy flows through the actual item that becomes its existence. Then there's another way in which Hashem impacts the world, and that's called sovev. In other words, an atmospheric recognition of some awe and greatness that exists in the world as such. So these are the two that we spoke about. The second one you can generate through meditative, contemplative endeavor. And that's as far as we got last week. Yes. Yes, it can. As I said, it's a gift, ahava rabbah. Then you may deserve the gift to occur from above, okay? But you can't get there on your own. That's the point. Why is it called ahavat olam? Because literally, ahavat olam means love of the world. But that's not what its intention is. There are two possibilities. One, the word olam also means eternal, forever. In other words, that kind of a love, once you are able to get into that phase, will always stay with you because you've got the key, the contemplative key to be able to awaken it. The other way of understanding it is love of the world, but not the superficial externality of the world, the external shell of the world, but understanding this Mamala and Sovev principles that I spoke about that really make up the real nature of the world. That also awakens and generates a love. So that is last week. What we're moving on to this week is yet a further form of love expression that the Alter Rebbe speaks about, which we loosely are going to call desire. Now, what is desire? So let's talk a little bit about it. Let's use the English word for the time being before I share with you what the exact Hebrew word is. When we use the word desire, what connotation does that have to you? What do you mean by the word desire? Something that you want, need, yearning. That's a synonym. Keep going. A basic passion. See how we're struggling with words, but they're mainly synonyms because it is hard to talk about emotions. That's one of the things we established last week. Words are not the best container for the expression of emotions. Behavior is. But we're at a class and we're talking, so we have to use words. So that becomes our most immediate vehicle. Something about desire, its distinction from love. Let's see if we can move in that direction. What's the difference between the words desire and love? All right, could be a sense like that. More activity, more passivity. Desire is something which is self-oriented. Desire is a hunger coming inwards, getting very close to things. Love is it's almost the opposite. You had your hands moving this way, and you had your hands moving that way, and that's very, very important, because that's really it. Desire is something that is me-centered. I need it, I want it. Love is a state of being. Let's go even more subtly, as the Alter Rebbe points out. Love means nearness, desire means distance. Think about that. To love means the experience of love now. To desire is to desire something which I haven't got at the moment. I desire it. Gap, connection. Love is a state of connection. Desire is a state of distance. And that's going to be very important in our understanding and discussion. And isn't it amazing, as we begin to dissect it from the vantage point of Chassidus, how these particular polarities give us a better understanding of words that we use commonly all the time. When you say you desire, you want something, what are you really saying? When you say, I love that, what are you really saying? Yeah.
Love is like love with a capital L, and then there's love with a small L.
Yes, we're going...
Which is actually self-centered as well.
It can be. We're going to talk about the both aspects flowing through higher self and lower self. Okay, so your point is a very, very good point. All these things can flow through the higher and lower self, even desire, as we're going to speak about it. There are planted within us positive loves, positive desires, that we are told in the Torah are like, and I mentioned this phrase last week, a genetic spiritual inheritance. How are our emotions shaped? Those of you who may have studied some psychology in one shape or form would have probably come across the discussion in your various textbooks, and it's interesting how we analyze it in our terms. The textbooks will say it's genetically predisposed, it's environmentally acquired, and that's quite reasonable. You know people who can share of themselves much more easily than others. They seem to have that, we say, nature. Okay, that's a summary word, nature. We haven't spoken about the dynamics. And then there are other people who find it very hard to share of themselves. Is it a matter of the way they were born? Were there some formative childhood experiences that caused that? Well, that's what psychiatrists are for, I guess, because it's going to be sometimes more of this, sometimes more of that, etc., etc. And yet we've got to bring a third factor, and that third factor is spiritual inheritance. I'm not going to go into greater depth right now about that, how our spiritual emotions are actually an inheritance from Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and how each one of them have embedded in perpetuity their formative emotion within each one of us, because we're going to have a class that's devoted to that. But nevertheless, we should at this point recognize that this is yet a further factor that provides an analytical tool in terms of understanding people's characters, people's natures, and the way that they respond to the exigency of any one moment. And then there's one more, the physical body. And you say, hold on, personality, physical body, does that really have a connection? The answer is absolutely. I mean, what is the physical body? We call it a kli, a keli, a container. Remember, I said to you, words are a good container to express mind, but words are not a great container to express emotions. Behavior is. The word container means anything to which something else flows into to collect it. Okay? It's an important concept in Kabbalah. For example, in the 10 Sefirot, the word Sefirot will define later on also, but the 10 qualities that are constantly creating the world. Right? You've got Chochmah, Bina, Das, Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, Malchut. Those 10. The lowest one, the Malchut, is the container which the others all pour into. Okay? Therefore, Malchut is feminine relative to the masculinity of the other 9. But there's even more subtler differentiations. For example, you have the first 2, Chochmah and Bina, and one is masculine relative to the other femininities. Then you have mind and emotion. Chochmah, Bina, and Das are masculine relative to the 7 emotions, which are feminine. So masculinity and femininity are relative terms in Kabbalistic teachings, and as Chassidus explains it. Having said that, They all each pour into a container, which then pours into another container. Like if you have, what's that wonderful chocolate dessert where you have things pouring over constantly? Yeah, the chocolate fountains. Really, that's what we're talking about here in this model of Chassidus. Okay? Now, the body is the container for the soul. The guf is the kli for the neshama. Therefore, no matter how good the neshama is, whatever the word good to neshama really means, it's still limited by the body. If I can give you a way out example, we understand that every element of creation is ensouled, possesses a spiritual core. Call it a nefesh. The stone possesses a nefesh. A planet possesses a nefesh. All the various heavenly bodies in our system of teaching are sentient, conscious elements that affect us profoundly, which fits in very, very nicely with astrology. And yet we're told we're not meant to consult astrology. And yet that doesn't mean that there isn't true astrology, because everything is interconnected. All we say is that the contemporary astrologers, when I say contemporary, I mean the ones for the last 2,000 years, are not particularly good in terms of the variations. But put that aside, even the Rambam, the rationalist par excellence, says that there is consciousness in all elements of existence, and we interrelate with it. Okay? The stone possesses a nefesh. So why doesn't it speak to me? Why doesn't it grow? Because the guf, the body of the stone, doesn't facilitate the mechanics that possibly is latent within that soul. There are wonderful Hasidic stories of Gilgulim, reincarnations, where sometimes you become reincarnated in an inanimate object, like a drop of water. I'm not going to now go through those wonderful Messias and stories, etc. But the reason why the expression is not there in those instances is because the body, the guf, doesn't facilitate. A flower, more flexibility. A flower has the flexibility of body where there is motion, inclination towards the sun, growth. An animal, the body has even greater mobility capacity and greater communicative capacity. Even flowers have a communicative capacity, right? We spoke about that, how flowers enjoy classical music much better than hard rock. No? Yes, yeah, definitely, right? There are apparently such experiments. At any rate, the point being that the human being has the body with the greatest flexibility. But even then, amongst human beings, there's higher end degrees of, shall we call it, spiritual flexibility. Where does that come from? And here comes the next factor that affects the nature of our personality. The body is primarily formulated by the mother and the father at the moment of conception. And in fact, the Tanya goes on and describes states of mind and states of emotion at the point of conception that affect the nature of the body of the child to be. And that becomes another variable that then subsequently affects it. So you can have an individual, and this is an example that's given in the Tanya, an individual who is born to parents who are, without wanting to sound class-oriented, relative simpletons, simple people. And the child grows up to be an extremely great gifted thinker. Where did that come from? Okay, so you say recessive characteristics, but that's not necessarily it. It might be. But what we say is, in fact, that the soul was a very, very major soul, but the purity and the loving nature of husband and wife, mother and father, the point of conception was such that it provided the flexibility of the body to be able to facilitate a much more powerful expression of mind and emotion. Isn't that nice? It's very powerful, very deep teaching. So you've got all these variables. You've got genes, environment, spiritual inheritance. You've got physical body. They're the four elements. Coming back to our subject now that we know what the variables are that allows the flow of love to penetrate, to flow as such, we come back to the question of desire and its comparison to love. And we have concluded that the difference is direction, your hand movements show that, and connection as opposed to distance. So the same person that you love, you can have a very strong desire for that person in that person's absence. Desire exists in absence, right? It may not be a desire for a person. It may be a desire for a food, right? The craving takes place when you, at that moment, are not eating and munching on the chocolate. You don't have the craving when you're munching on the chocolate. You have the craving when you're not munching on the chocolate, okay? So what we have here is that distance and gap is a definition of what desire is. That's really what it takes place. And the word that we use in the Hebrew language derives from a pasuk, a verse in Sefer Yeshayahu, the book of Isaiah. There it says, Nafshi ivisicha balayla. My soul, I yearn for you at night. The word is ivisicha. That's the verb, iviticha, in contemporary Hebrew. And the noun is ta'ava, or what we contemporary in Yiddishized colloquialism call taiva. You know, you might have heard from your Baba and Zeta, I have a taiva for something. What's it used in its colloquial sense? I have a yearning for something. I have a taiva right now to have some horseradish, or whatever it might be, right? That's how the word might be used colloquially or whatever, because in those days they ate more horseradish than we do today, okay? We have different taivas, as we're going to see. So the word is ta'ava. The word comes from the Sefer de Yeshayahu, and it means longing, yearning, pining. What is Isaiah, in fact, there talking about? He is, of course, collectively talking through himself as the prophet of the Jewish people, and there he's talking about the Jewish people's longing for the connectedness to Hashem at night. What does it mean at night? So if you look at Metzudas David and others, at night is a metaphor. Yes, exile, exactly. The Metzudas David says, in exile. In absence is when we have the craving. In absence is when we have the yearning. It's in exile we realize what we've got. Here we have Eretz Yisrael today. We have our country. And here we give ourselves the luxury of denigrating it and arguing about whether it's behaving correctly or incorrectly, etc., etc. Go back to pre-1948 and you'll find that every Jew was yearning for our own country. And everyone would be positive. Today we have it, so we're in a state of love, but in a state of love is not the same feeling as a state of desire. Very, very important point. So you've got these kind of synonyms in terms of yearning, pining, etc. Any questions? So that's what we're talking about today, the nature of desire. We haven't yet discussed the fact that it may flow through the higher self and the lower self. So we have to consider these factors. In other words, what's positive desire? What's negative desire? What's the relationship of desire to addiction? Are they on the same plane? Are they different phenomena? Or is one an extension of the other? Is one more bodily oriented and the other one is more emotionally oriented? Can it be spiritually oriented? Can you be a spiritual addict? These are the things we have to now try to grapple with in order to be able to come up to some conclusive understanding of the nature of ta'ava, what it actually is. So, when we talk about the lower form and the higher form, as we did last week of ahava, love, this week of ta'ava, desire. Let's do it together. What might be the result if I channel my desire through the nefesh bahamis, through my lower order self, through my ego self, through my self-oriented dimension? What might be some of the results or examples of how desire then becomes manifest in our lives? Infidelity. Now, related to desire, it's good what you said, related to desire. How does infidelity relate to the word desire? I mean, it's obvious, but let's spell it out. You desire the person that you're not with. Okay, fine. All right, good. Coming to other terms that come across. Let's take something which is less contentious. Let's talk about sugar craving. Okay? What does that mean? What does that mean? What does sugar craving mean? At a physical level, it means that somewhere along the line you've reached a point where the physiology of the body has been so evolved in this direction that there's a chemical need. And that chemical need becomes expressed through the mind through a sense of craving. Okay? Did it arise from somewhere even more profound, though? Is that the only thing? Is chemistry the sole arbiter of cravings? Go on.
No, it could also be as a result of the lack of feeling loved, and the sugar is a substitute.
Okay, so now we're talking about what is used in contemporary language, emotional eating. What's emotional eating mean? But you do feel that you want the food, that you do need it, okay? But it's really somewhere along the line a substitute for a more profound lack, and in this case we say an emotional lack, okay? Food is really an excellent kind of friend. It doesn't talk back at you. It services you very nicely. It fulfills your needs. What better friend can you have than food, right? And that's why it serves that purpose. But take it even more profound than that. Beyond the fact that it serves an emotional need. Where did that emotional need come from? Why are we in a state possibly of imbalance for those people who do have eating disorders that we call emotional eating? Because somewhere along the line, the balance between their mind self, the emotional self, and their inner spiritual nature is off key. And therefore we have to go even more profound and understand what's happening in their spiritual undercurrent that underlies what becomes an emotional need and an emotional expression. So all these things are part of the lower order self. They come to service my need. Okay? Let's look at when it comes through a higher order self. The nefesh elokis. When is a desire, as a value judgment, because it flows through the higher self, a good thing? When can you have, what does it mean to have positive desire? Or is desire always going to be negative because it's always this? Can it be such a thing as a positive desire? Volunteer. So the idea of merger with Hashem is still possibly, let me play devil's advocate, isn't that satisfying my need? I need Hashem's closeness. Or I desire my wife, I desire my brother, I desire my sister, I desire my children. I want my children with me. I happen to have 4 children in Israel, right? I want my children with me. Could anyone fault such an expression of desire? You'll all say, oh yeah, that's really, really nice. Is it? Well, yeah. It's not easy, because... Yeah, but what does attachment mean? Attachment is not a Jewish idea, it's a Buddhist idea. Ah, okay, so it's self-owned. I want them. So I should never want to have my children with me? So I should deny myself such an emotion. The intention behind it. In other words, there may be a positive and negative intention behind desiring it. What could be a positive intention? Because we're talking about the pious self. Yeah, we miss them, but miss them is my problem, right? Miss them is, I need to deal with my problem. I miss them. Hmm? It's not easy, is it? But it's wrong to say we would deny ourselves the pleasure of the company of a loved individual. Because when it becomes a true love, as we spoke about last week, it's not what it does for me, but it's states of oneness. It's what I can confer for you. In other words, true love, we said last week, is all about me doing this, sharing, giving, contributing, as opposed to taking, needing, wanting. So in the case of desire, it's possible to think in terms of desire of, I want to be in a possibility, in a circumstance where I can give, where I can contribute, where I can help. And that becomes considered a higher order desire. Not because I'm getting something from it, but there's states of oneness that occur in that state of being. Again, subtle, but a real difference. Oh, very. That's why they're messed up all the time. Absolutely. Yeah. A very classic example you raised, charity. And that's why the Rambam, Maimonides, notes 8 levels of charity. Not just 1 or 2, 8 levels. Because, as you said, the kavanah, the intention, and the nature of the giving has so many different nuances. By the way, do you know what the highest level of the 8 is? Most people will say giving secretly, beseser, that's the second highest. The highest is, as you've said correctly, facilitating someone else to stand on their feet. And that's what silent partnership is usually about. The best way to give charity is to enter into a relationship with that individual where their self-esteem is maintained by entering into an equal partnership, which means I'll provide the funds, so to speak, you provide the effort, and I recognize that we're 50-50. That's protecting the sense of self of the other. That's the highest level of charity. Yeah. And that occurs in parenting also. How many parents live their childhood through their children? They want their kids to succeed, and they'll do everything to succeed, but sometimes the kavanah and the intention is not, and they may not even realize it, altruistic. It may be quite the opposite. They love their child, but part of that complexity of that love is to satisfy a need I have. I want my child to succeed because when my child succeeds, it reflects on me. I want my child to succeed because then I won't have any guilt feelings. I want my child to succeed because I want to make sure that they make a lot of money. I mean, I'm being crude. But the point is, I'm giving these examples because that often is the state of play. If we really love our child, then we want the child to succeed in a way which is true for the child. And there is a whole introduction to the second section of the book of Tanya that says, always educate a child according to its way, meaning not your way, but its personality, its nature. Because then, if you're able to educate the child according to its nature, that'll stick. If you try to impose something extraneous, you're going to create difficulties, obviously, later on. Okay? So there is a higher form of ta'ava, etc., and there's a lower form of ta'ava. And we spoke about it. It's interesting that there is also an issue of spiritual ta'ava, positive and negative. Is it possible to conceive of a spiritual posture that could possibly go through the lower order self? Can you be spiritual and egotistic through your spirituality? Can you be spiritual and be ego-driven? They call that. Well, let's say they're engaged in apparent spiritual activity. So the example that I always give is meditation, right? And I always say, you and I know of individuals who spend hours and hours each morning in deep meditative repose, astral projecting, out-of-body experiencing, speaking with all the angelic creatures, and come back and remain absolutely obnoxious people. So that, again, you're saying they don't be... Yeah. See, we have here an issue of what spirituality means, right? What is spirituality? Now, I suppose in contemporary language we're using the word spiritual with a small s, right? Because that's the way it's used generically in our society at large. And therefore many things fall within the rubric of spirituality. You've got things like meditation, you've got things like non-animal products, you've got things like thinking green, you've got things, all sorts of things falls within the loose word spirituality. So if a person is meditating, you have to say they're engaged in a spiritual activity as opposed to something else, laying bricks, although that can be spiritual too if you make it spiritual. Okay, but the point is, what is it doing? Is it filtering through the higher self or lower self? When someone comes to me and says, Laibl, I want to be a better person, I don't think anyone in this room would quarrel with that, except me. And I'll ask the person, what do you mean you want to be a better person? Laibl, I want to grow. I want to become a better person. How selfish of you. What do you mean selfish? I want to grow. That's selfish. So what should I aspire to? You should not aspire to grow. You should aspire to become a better facilitator, a better friend, a better partner. What's the difference? I want to grow is about me. The other side of the coin, which you just enunciated, is about you. Facilitating, partnering, parenting, that's all about the other. It's not enough to say, I want to grow. You have to go and follow through. There has to be a higher purpose. And that's where spirituality can become egotistic. I want to become a better meditator. I want to become better in yoga. I want to become better at... There is an issue of ego involved here. Even though the world tells you these are very fine activities. And therefore the kavanah, as you correctly said, Shlomo, the idea that we have some higher intent behind the activity defines it in Jewish terms, whether it's truly spiritual or not spiritual, etc. And that is defined not by the word spiritual, but do we direct it through our higher order self or our lower order self? And these are very, very important factors to factor in. Same with learning. The Torah says you shouldn't, the Pirkei Avot says, the ethics of the fathers, you shouldn't study in order to want to be a Talmud Chacham. I'll be the great rabbi. I'm going to study. I'm going to give the best shiur out. I'm going to be really great. Everyone's going to admire me. They're going to walk away and I'm going to feel, wow. Yeah, there's a temptation of all that. What should we learn? Why should we learn? Because the Torah is the glue that allows me to connect to Hashem. Why do I go and study the nature of love and relationships? Why might I send someone to a course in positive relationships between husband and wife? Not so that the person becomes a better husband and the wife becomes a better wife, but so that they glue together better, so that there's oneness that arises from it. That's the higher intent. In all things, everything, you can elevate it or degrade it. I can eat because I need to satisfy myself, or I can eat because my process of eating with a bracha and drawing down that energy and with the kavanah of getting the energy to help the world, help the next person, elevates the nitzutz, the nefesh spark of the food itself. A higher consciousness in the very act of eating. Eating, as someone said before, gluttonously, self-orientation, satisfying self, or eating for a higher purpose, nefesh behamit, nefesh elokit. Everything in life, all thought, all speech, all behavior, we have a choice, bechira chavshis, of directing through our higher self and lower self. And how do we do that? By living consciously, or what another tradition says, living mindfully. That's hard work. Can you imagine walking through the day, always being aware of what it is that I'm expressing? That's desirable. So, I always say, my pass mark for my students is always 7 out of 10. If you get 7 out of 10, I'll give you a pass mark. Don't seek to be a perfectionist. Don't seek to be the perfect master. Don't seek to become the Buddha within. What you need to do is to become a person who sometimes forgets, but then quickly remembers. At least that. At least that. Because there's so many people who walk without ever practicing consciousness, but just what happens to be my need at that point of time. What's the most profound desire? What's the greatest taiva that a human being can express? You tell me. I'm just opening it up. What's the greatest desire that you have? Happiness, okay. Nachon, life. Would you not say that's the greatest desire that we have, to live? You can't practice happiness if you're dead. Or rather difficult, without a body. Life is probably the strongest drive, and that's why it's called, in the West, the instinctive drive of survival drive, okay? The instinctive survival format. So to live, to want to live, is number one. But then again, to live is qualitatively, even that can be qualitatively defined in terms of higher and lower. What does it mean to live? To breathe air and to eat food and to survive day to day, that doesn't satisfy the quality of life. And that's when your second order desires come into it. Profound ones. Happiness, fulfillment, self-actualization. All these things become the second order set of desires. It's not enough simply to survive. We need to have survival through the higher order self. Life has to have subjective meaning to you. Otherwise, it becomes something which is mere survival, no different than an animal in many respects. Now, when I say that, I'm not denigrating an animal, and I'm not suggesting for one moment, oh, I'm much better than an animal. All I'm saying is Hashem created an animal with certain aptitudes in terms of its body and its soul powers, and the human being likewise with its own soul powers and its body. And you can only draw comparison in each particular level. You can compare animals to animals and humans to humans, right? But you shouldn't start comparing something which is radically different, of a different order itself. Okay, so that is a consideration of higher and order desires, ta'ava as such. And then you've got the question of lower order desires, which we generally call sensual desires, that are profound expressions of the senses. When we say sensual desires, what we're talking about is something fairly superficial in spiritual terms. We're saying we need to satisfy our physical order self. That's also an aspect of lower order self. Not that I'm saying, therefore, we should be the opposite, ascetics, deny ourselves, hurt ourselves. In some religious groupings, they deliberately practice inflicting pain, that somehow this creates a sense of humility or whatever it might be. That's not the Jewish way at all. In fact, it's quite contrary to the Jewish way. For us, happiness is a terribly important factor. But at the same time, we have to understand that we are constantly plagued also by our senses in terms of sensual desires. So the idea then is to elevate them, to once again redirect them through the higher order self. There's a reason why we enjoy the beautiful smell of a scent or a perfume. There's a reason why we enjoy the touch of something soft and something rough. There's a reason why we enjoy to hear the music rather than noise. Because there's something profoundly sacred, holy, elevating, whatever word you want to use, when it comes through the higher order self. And that's why the senses have been given to us. So it's not sensuality or sensuousness that actually is in any fault. It's how we utilize our senses for a higher order self or a lower order self, etc. I want to speak about one more thing, and that's addiction. Because let's talk about different formats of addiction. The most common addictions that we know of course, is substance abuse. But I want to take addictions that are not so chemically profound, but nevertheless are examples of addiction. I want to talk about people addiction. People who are afraid of loneliness, and therefore need to have constantly either people around them or noise around them. Can't stand to be by themselves can't stand to be in states of silence, etc., etc., although we all need those moments of aloneness. There's many addictions. Yeah, I'm just choosing one. There's no shortage for what is, but the point I'm going to ask you now is, what is the word addiction? What does the word addiction mean? If we're going to use addiction in this broad sense, not just substance abuse that is very highly physiologically dominated, but perhaps things which are less physiologically dominated, what do we mean by the word addiction? Add. Good. Right. Yeah. Okay, so we know its functionality, to fill an emptiness, to fill a void, but what is it? Okay, structure. What did you say, sorry? Destruction, yes. Distraction, now I'm getting it right. Okay, distraction, in other words, not to face something which might be the deeper, more profound confrontation that you are subliminally or below the surface needing to deal with, and therefore that's really, really unpleasant, so you move to something else to take its place, to take its time.
It's also a destruction of satisfaction. An addiction implies an insatiable inability to fill a hole.
But you do temporarily fill it. There are moments of high, and there are moments of being filled.
I think it's instantaneous satisfaction, so you don't need to desire something which may have
Instant gratification, okay, but it's the in-between times that become a real difficulty, because you can't be in a constant state of high unless you lead a very strange life, yes. That could be a very profound aspect, fear of death, but what kind of addiction might present itself from that? There may well be many as such. I'm still struggling, and I'd like us to evolve. What does it mean, addiction? What defines an addiction more so than a desire? Control? Addiction is when the grooves of the mind are so profoundly, what's the word for grooved out? Dug out, whatever it might be, imprinted, whatever word you may want to use, when they're so profoundly there that your ability to move out of those grooves is very, very sorely curtailed. And therefore you must stay there. Otherwise there'll be extreme fear or extreme unpleasantness or extreme whatever. In other words, when you are in a state of addiction, your freedom is limited to the greatest extent. And because freedom of choice, Bechira Chavshis, is the meaning of life, it becomes actually the greatest antithesis and the greatest self-enslavement. It's the greatest Mitzrayim. The word Mitzrayim, which translates as Egypt, but Mitzrayim comes from the Hebrew word Meitzar, which means constraint, limitation. Geographically, in Hebrew, when we talk about straits, like the Straits of Tiran or certain, it means a narrow body of water hemmed in by land. That's where the word Meitzar comes from. And Mitzrayim means a state of constraint as such. And addiction is one of the greatest states of constraint. How, therefore, what is therefore its antithesis? Liberation, freedom. And I guess all therapy is based on that. The idea to be able to experience the possibility of that freedom and to develop the ratzon, the willpower that can undo the habituation of those grooves in order to be able to escape it. In other words, allow the body, in fact, to be reshaped so that the neshama can flow more optimally through it. Your willpower has the capacity to reshape the cells of the body, the electrostatics of the mind. And then you can change from the inside out that in state of enslavement. Otherwise, the desire becomes an addiction. Very important issues here. You can become addicted, obviously, to a person. We call that sometimes dependency, depending on the nature of that. So it's got a very, very broad definition. Okay, any other thoughts or questions in terms of some of the material we raised this evening? So your example is perhaps easier to deal with because it's the example at the edge of things as opposed to the normative circumstances of most people in life. When pain becomes so intense, when whether that be emotional pain or physical pain or etc., that life is not worth living. Let's put that aside because that's a real circumstance, but it's far from the common one, right? Around this table, I think you would find no one, okay? Whatever. I'm sure if we went around the table here, no one would exercise that choice. So although it's valid what you say, I don't want to speak about the extremist vantage point at the moment. And that also is an extremist point of view, transcendence. But why I'm just momentarily interested in it, because there's a precedent in the Chumash. There actually is an instance of that. Who can recall what instance that was? Yeah, Aaron's two sons. Aaron's two sons, Aaron's the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, and his two sons have been trained to be priests, to be Kohanim. We don't have to study here what it meant to be a Kohen, etc. It's not an issue of status, it's an issue of functionality, what they had to do in the in context of the service for the Jewish people. But we know one thing, that in context of that avodah, their souls were able to move to very, very high states of transcendence. And on one particular occasion, the two sons moved to such a point of absolute, what's the English word, bliss, that they blissed out. They didn't want to return. And they didn't return. Okay? Yeah, they returned. The way we understand, there's many ways to understand the Eish Sarah. The way I'm explaining it through Chassidus is the Eish Sarah wasn't that they were zapped by fire, but in fact it was that they reached a state of such transcendence that they had a foreign experience. What does that mean, a foreign experience? A fiery foreign experience. So we see it in the consequences. We're told that what happened to the two sons, they died. They expired. What did they do so terrible? Why do we want to quest for transcendence? What's so horrible about that? That's a very, very delightful and a very, very salutary kind of aim. Comes the answer that even though it's delightful, it's personally highly experiential, it's very, very fulfilling, but these are all self factors. The purpose of creation wasn't to satisfy yourself. Even in transcendence, the purpose of life is to come back and operate at grassroots level at the seemingly ordinary and mundane state of earth. Same with the spies who came from spying out the land of Israel and said, we can't win. So again, as the Rebbe explains, the spies, who were they? These were great individuals. They were the Nesiim, they were the princes. They were clever people. They weren't scared of what they saw. They did not want the Jewish people to go into a place where they had to use their hands to till the soil and be able to work the land. Why? Here I can sit in the desert and I can study Torah and I've got water coming from Miriam's well and I've got manna I can eat and I've got a dry cleaner through the clouds cleaning my clothes. Wow, that's what we want to do. Very, very good. What's wrong with that? To sit and be able to become holy individuals. Nothing wrong. Very wrong. They were killed. A whole generation had to die because of that. Why? That's not the intent of creation. The intent of creation is not to sit at Laibl's table all day and night and study the stuff. The purpose is to come for 1 hour and spend the next week becoming a better person and facilitating the growth of others and making the world a better place. That's what it's all about. So Aaron's sons The spies exemplify exactly the same thing. The desire for transcendence wasn't a sufficient raison d'etre. In fact, it's the opposite of the intention of the creation of the earth. Enough for this week. More to come. We're going to look at another aspect of love next week. And that aspect of love is going to be about love between relations. Filial love. Husband-wife love. Parent-child love. Where does that come from? And we're going to distinguish it from the kind of loves that we've been speaking about so far. It's another category of love. Those of you who want to read ahead, it's chapter 45 in Sefer Tanya. But we're going to distinguish it and distinguish the dynamics of that particular love from the ones that we have here and look at the proprieties of those love.